Well, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. As I think we've done this training a couple of other times, and so I am using a very similar slide deck. If you've been to the training before, it might be some, old information that we're going over, although it's always really important, and I'm always happy to do it. Just as a quick kind of orientation to the training itself, I am going to talk about generally how DHCD is structured in terms of funding, how on the capital side, like what kinds of work that we are, what kind of work that we are looking at, and what defines a capital project versus another kind of project, like just kind of giving a general orientation to general capital funding and what it means when you're putting together a capital plan. I'm also going to take some time towards the end to just talk about different funding streams so that when folks are looking at their capital plans, knowing that when we talk about, what kind of funding is available, or when executive directors are putting together the capital plan, just know that they are really looking at one particular funding stream, and sometimes there are other options available. So I just wanted to kind of let you guys know that towards the end I will be kind of reviewing a little bit more about different kinds of funding that's possible. Okay. Also, I should say that I am Stephanie Brynan. I am the Director of Project Management on the for the Capital Bureau at the Department of Housing and Community Development. Okay. So basically, DHCD's Division of Public Housing is split into two main bureaus. One is Housing Management, and the other one is Housing Development and Construction. I work on the Housing Development and Construction side. That's what we call capital, right? And kind of the definition of capital is pretty much like large scale construction is what we mean when we say it's capital project. It's large scale construction. And while most of the reports that the housing authorities get, it falls under housing management scope. Capital improvement plans or like major construction improvement plans fall under the purview of the Bureau of Housing Development and Construction. So in the Bureau of Housing Development and Construction, we have three primary units. We have project management, which is my team. We have the architects and engineers, and then we have construction advisors. The project management unit is the one that looks at the budgets and schedule for every project. They work with housing authorities on their whole pipeline of projects, and keeps track of how much money every single authority has to be able to spend on projects. So that's what my team does. The architects and engineers are the ones who work with the designers on projects. They make sure that the designs are up to code, and that they are viable and actually doable. I mean, that most of our designers know how to make viable and doable projects, but our architects and engineers are really, really good at tweaking and making sure that the design fits our various codes and requirements. And then the construction advisors are the team that is on hand while construction is happening. So they are in the field, they are working with the construction contractors and making sure that, again, everything is kind of going the way it needs to go. Every LHA has an assigned person from each unit that's dedicated to helping them implement a capital project. And LHA staff are very familiar with their team, and we're in constant contact throughout the lifespan of a project. There's also there's a program that we also have called the Regional Capital Assistance Teams. Housing authorities with under 500 state-aided public housing units may be a part of the RCATS program. The RCATS have an additional team that assists housing authorities with putting together their capital plans, and they also implement projects themselves, as project managers for projects that are under $100,000. The RCATS also help the LHAs assess their capital needs, and they serve as a resource during the plan creation process. So if you work with or belong to a housing authority that has under 500 units, then you might be familiar with or your housing authority is participating in the RCAT program. There are 3 RCAT teams that each cover their own geographical area. And as you can see, here's the green, which is the Central West, blue is the Northeast, and the orange is the Southeast. And the RCAT program itself was created to provide more assistance to housing authorities that 500 units is not small, but they are not amongst the largest, and sometimes don't have the staffing to really be able to tend to the capital side of the work that needs to happen at a housing authority. And so the RCAT teams are really intended to be a very good resource to housing authorities. Okay, so a capital improvement plan is a report that LHAs submit to DHCD every year. And it's a tool that DHCD developed to help housing authorities create a pipeline or a schedule for their upcoming projects and to plan for their spending. A complete CIP is a 5-year plan which identifies capital projects, provides planning scope and schedule and budget for each capital project, and identifies the funding sources for each project. And then an approved CIP is required for DHCD to approve, put funding towards that project. So we do tend to get a lot of questions about what's the difference between capital funds and operating funds. Capital funds, these definitions are federal definitions. They come from the federal government. And so it's good to know that if you guys do have federal properties, the definitions are same for those guys. But capital funds are construction projects that the LHA is doing on their building and their site. It's large projects like roof replacement, paving, window installation, elevator repairs, siding, like comprehensive changes to the structure of the buildings and the site themselves. Operating funds are used to support the day-to-day operations. That includes staffing, but it also includes maintenance, gutter cleaning, snow removal, and just various kinds of upkeep. One of the distinctions that we like to say between capital funds and operating funds is capital funds are used to replace lighting in a building. Operating funds are used to replace light bulbs. They're very, very different kinds of spending that housing authorities need to do. And they have, and just so you know, housing authorities do have 2 different kind of budgets that they use for both operating and capital. They're separate buckets. And every once in a while, there are some gray areas. I think like vacant unit turnovers. When there's a vacant unit at a housing authority, oftentimes it just requires some new paint, some upgrades, some maybe clean the flooring or carpet, maybe replace the carpet. Those kinds of things are generally considered operating funds because it's just general maintenance. However, sometimes the vacant units require a much more comprehensive kind of unit comprehensive work to the unit, and so it would fall under capital. And so that's kind of where it can be more of a gray area, but for the most part, there's day-to-day funds, and then there's, again, if you think about it in terms of real structural changes to the buildings and the site itself, that tends to be capital. And like I said, these two are two very different buckets. Even DHCD, we fund both of these buckets, but from two separate parts of the agency, and we get the money from two different places as a state agency. So for example, the capital funds, right? It's the capital money comes from the Commonwealth's annual budget through bond bills. The spending is planned and allocated by various agencies, specifically the Office for Administration and Finance, which is kind of under the Office of Administration and Finance is under the governor's office and kind of spans all of the spending across the Commonwealth. The bond cap, and again, that's the amount of money that we get from bond bills, right? It's funded by long-term bonds that are repaid with tax revenue that the Commonwealth receives through the operating budget. And that's the Commonwealth, like the state's ongoing operating budget is where we get those funds. For example, in fiscal year 2020, the administration allocated DHCD's public housing division $109.5 million in capital funds across the whole Commonwealth. And I will show you in the following slides exactly how that's portioned out. On the other hand, operating funds are appropriated each year through an annual budget process. So operating funds come through special determinations every year that are voted on through the legislature. They're dispersed to housing authorities based on the overall funding levels and their allowable expenses, and it kind of takes the annual revenue from rents into consideration. Operating funds are funded by the current year's taxes as opposed to kind of bond bills from the capital side. And again, for example, in fiscal year 2020, the Commonwealth's budget provides $72 million in operating subsidies for local housing authorities. So capital funding over time, right? As you can see, in 2005, we were funded around $55 million. It stayed consistent and went up in 2009. And if you guys then remember, right around then, we had some budget difficulties, right, across the country and in the state. And so the amount that we were given went down to around $85 million. Since then, it's been kind of hovering around the $85 to $95 million mark right up until 2020. And that's when it became $109 million annually. And that's where it stayed. That we've gotten consistently the same amount every year since 2020, which is amazing considering COVID. One of the reasons why it kind of stops at 2020 is that COVID really did mess us. Like we got the same amount of funding, but we weren't able to spend it all because of COVID. We shut down, but we have had consistent funding levels since then. So that's been really, really amazing. So the different kinds of funding that we have at DHCD is what, like when we talk about the bond cap, one of the primary ways that we spend that bond cap is through formula funding. You guys, if you've been at all involved in the creation of a capital plan, you'll probably have heard about formula funding. It's in a housing authority's share, like literally their percentage of the bond cap that's allocated annually. In fiscal year 22, the formula funding budget was for $52.5 million, and that's across all housing authorities. So it's $52.2 million of the $109.5 million bond cap amount. Oops, hold on, that's a little bit early. The amount of formula funding that a housing authority receives is based on their need and the size of their portfolio. So the need is determined based on the condition of the housing authority's existing buildings, as reported in our CPS, or our capital planning system. It's a IT system that we have where housing authorities are, once a project is completed, that information is updated, and it's basically an inventory of like your roofs, your walls, your windows, your electrical components. Like it's just an inventory of all of them, and that inventory system keeps track of how up to date those components are. So every 5 years, DHCD procures a statewide assessment to inform formula funding allocation. So we have a consultant go out and make sure that, as best they can, the information in CPS is as up to date as possible. And then CPS catalogs the condition of every building and site, and the housing authorities update it as projects are completed. And then we use that information to see what the need is in the various areas. And so a CIP will focus mostly on formula funding spending. The capital plan basically is how your housing authority is suggesting or requesting that their formula funds, their annual formula funds, are going to be spent for that year and for the next 3 years. And of course, it gets updated every year. LHAs program their formula funds through the CIP process, and then they apply for competitive funds through periodic grant rounds, and that's external to the CIP process. So when I mentioned the bond cap, like I had mentioned, formula funding is about 58% of the bond cap. We have about 9% of that amount that goes to special awards, 23% goes to competitive awards, and then it's 10% of administrative costs that cover the oversight and planning of the capital projects. Special award, an example of special awards, and I think I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into this, but special awards would be like I mentioned before, vacant unit awards. Like if there's if a housing authority doesn't have sufficient funds to do a more comprehensive overhaul of a vacant unit, they can apply for a special award. There's also, we have a special award would be an example of like asbestos remediation, right? We don't ask housing authorities to use their formula funds for remediation purposes. So we have a special pot of money that's just for like asbestos remediation. Those are different kinds of examples of the special awards. And then the competitive awards, and I'm going to go into this a little bit later, but the competitive awards are large scale awards like mod phases, you guys might have heard of, or HILAPP programs. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what those look like. But those are where we issue kind of funding availability for these large scale competitive awards, and different housing authorities submit applications for them and kind of compete with each other around how much they are able to get. All right, so the basics of building a CIP. The housing authority identifies all the projects they want to complete in the next 5 years. They kind of, do the assessment annually, and then when it comes time to put together the report, they list them all, make sure that they're all included in our CIP program, and then they prioritize them. They say, this is the one we really need to do this year. These are the ones that we want to do in the next 2 to 3 fiscal years. And the projects are arranged in the CIP based on their priority and their cost. Presumably those with the highest priority will be entered in earlier start dates than those with lower priorities. And sometimes we have them spanning a couple of different fiscal years. So for example, if you're a smaller authority, you might not be able to afford like how much it's going to cost for an entire roof replacement and have it be like 1 fiscal year. So sometimes we have the roof replacement span 2 fiscal years so that we can afford to spend 2 fiscal years worth of spending on that one project. As part of the CIP process, the funding sources are selected, and then they submit, the housing authority submits the CIP, and then the project managers review it. They make sure that the funding is really available, that the timeline for that funding is accurate, and then they approve the projects, or kind of sometimes they move the projects around in terms of timing. But the project managers are the ones that do like the final approval of the capital plans. And then that approval is sent to the housing authority it's an approval letter, but it's basically an email that the housing authority gets that they can begin the work and what the project numbers are. To dig a little bit deeper into the review process, DHCD reviews the CIPs for 3 main things. to ensure that the housing authority has appropriately prioritized their projects. So for example, if a roof is leaking, we want to make sure that that is kind of up first, as opposed to maybe site work around paving or something. Although oftentimes I know that paving, it can be a real health and safety issue, but a leaking roof unfortunately often has to take precedence over paving. We also look to ensure that the housing authority plans to spend their formula funding limits, so they can't go over their spending for each year. The LHA should spend a minimum of 80% of its past 3 fiscal years of awarded formula funding, and it should not spend more than it's available within the 5-year period. And I know that can be kind of confusing, but while we annually give the housing authorities an allocation of formula funds, we also know that projects don't fall within like fiscal year categories. And so that's why we try to say, please spend 80% of your funding in, for over 3 fiscal years kind of thing, or don't exceed 5 years. It's because we really do know that there are ebbs and flows, right? That there's times when housing authorities have to save up to be able to complete a large scale project, or need to do it ASAP, but that means that they might not have as much funding over the subsequent fiscal years. So we really do try to work with people to spend within their limits, but also understand that projects don't fall in fiscal years. So how do we accommodate that? And so we really do try to look at things over 3 and 5 year periods. We also use the CIP to review, oh my goodness, sorry about that. To review special award requests. And those requests often happen outside of the CIP, but they are included in the CIP itself, so that those funds can be included in the kind of overall snapshot that we have of a housing authority's projects and where that money comes from. When a CIP comes in, it's first reviewed by the architect or engineer, depending on the project, just to make sure that the project is, the scope and cost is kind of in line with what their experience is. And then it goes to the DHCD project manager that takes a look at, again, like the funding and the schedule. And then the DHCD project manager does the final approval and make sure that the award is, and the project is actually active in our system. So you might wonder, like, what's your role? What do you guys have to do with our capital improvement process? And just so you know, the CIPs are required to get the LHA board approval before they can submit it to us. The executive director will likely present a scenario spreadsheet to a board meeting for board review. The spreadsheet is generated by the CIP system, and it lays out timeline and spending projections for the projects that the LHA has submitted. So for example, right, let's say you have drainage pipe replacements, and you can see that that is slated to spend, here we go, here. Oh my goodness, so sorry, I thought I was doing a pointer. You can see that it's here in year 5. And the priority projects, if you look down for kitchen modernization and unit turnover, is projected to spend in year 1, right? So you can see that those 2 projects are in year 1, and they are the highest priority for the housing authority for that year. And then as you can see, the kitchen modernization project is spanning 2 fiscal years, right? And then because it's such a large project, they don't have anything going on in year 3 because they've spent it all, right, in years 1 and 2. And then you can see that they have a couple of small projects in year 4, and then are able to spend a much larger amount in year 5. So that's kind of how it's spent. We look at a 5-year period. It usually does kind of follow this very similar pattern. Both the CIP report submissions and our competitive funding applications need to be presented to LHA residents for comments and questions. And a letter from the head of the resident organization or representative of residents needs to be uploaded and or included with each CIP and or competitive funding application submission, and that is a requirement. So oftentimes applications and CIP reviews are done at the board level, but each also is required to have some kind of opportunity for residents to give feedback and to participate in the conversation of what the priorities of the housing authority is, so that kind of so that your perspective is included when it's finally submitted to DHCD. So an example of formula funding, right? I think this is in Lawrence. As you can see before in this lower left-hand corner, there was just a large paving section where kids tended to play, and then it was redone to have a lot more trees and grass. And then for the paving spot, it was really intentionally just beautified. It is really trying to look a little bit more inviting and just a nicer place. Here we also have in Lawrence, we had a vacant lot, more or less, that was kind of situated in the courtyard between all of these three developments. And then afterwards, you see that they put in like a little playground in here for kids and teens to be able to play on. Oh, I did not do that. Okay. I see that there is someone in the chat that has a question, and I will definitely get to you as soon as I can. So I know I talked before about different kinds of DHCD funding. We had the formula funding, we had non-competitive funding, and we have competitive funding. So this is where I kind of talk a little bit more about what the non-competitive funding looks like. Besides formula funding, there are a few types of, quote, other funding that the Housing Authority can request to use in their CIP, and they're awarded on a case-by-case basis, and we review it in DHCD management. So compliance reserve is one bucket of funds, and it's used for projects required to comply with laws, codes, or regulations. And for example, again, this is like a reasonable accommodation request, asbestos or lead remediation, things like that comes from our compliance reserve. Those are things that we don't expect a housing authority to have to pay for through formula funds. We have emergency funds that are used when a housing authority has depleted their formula funding, but an emergency situation arises that cannot wait for next year's formula funding allocation. And then, of course, there are sustainability funds that are used for projects that improve the energy efficiency or thermal performance of a building. Let's see really quick. Here, I'm going to move this over here. Okay. I see you're talking about the mandate for housing authorities to have resident involvement. Yeah, it is sometimes hard for residents to know exactly what's going on, and that's one of the reasons why we have these kinds of trainings, so that you guys understand what the process is and know what the expectations are. Okay, let's see. Okay, so competitive funding, examples of competitive funding is when we have competitive funds, we issue what we call a NOFA, or a notice of funding availability, and it gets posted on our website, and an email blast goes out to all of the staff at the housing authorities. And when we have when a NOFA goes out, it's basically, since it's competitive, we want to make sure that all the housing authorities know about what the funding is asking for and for targeting. And we also want to make sure everyone knows about the deadlines and the requirements. These competitive awards are meant to fund large, comprehensive projects. And the NOFA, which is issued via a public housing notice, hopefully you guys know what those are, but it's public housing notices are just anything that DHCD wants to make sure that the housing authorities are aware of. We issue a PHN, and that PHN outlines an application process, eligibility criteria, and how we score the different applications. DHCD also hosts a Q&A session for housing authorities before the applications are due and publishes a transcript of questions asked and answered. And all of this stuff is available on our website so that all housing authorities will get access to that information. Board members need to approve a housing authority's application for competitive funding through a board vote before it can be submitted. And the slides that, and then I'm going to be telling you a little bit more about the recent and current funding opportunities. One big opportunity that we've had in the last year is ARPA. Now, ARPA is a federal bill, right? And Massachusetts received $5.2 billion in federal funding from the American Rescue Plan Act. This was last year. And so on December 13th of 2021, Governor Baker signed legislation appropriating up to $2.55 billion of the uncommitted ARPA funds, as well as $1.45 billion in state fiscal year for 2021 surplus dollars. And this legislation included $600 million for housing. So public housing itself, just our department, got $150 million to preserve and upgrade our the developments that you guys live in, which is really exciting. 21 housing authorities were awarded earmarks in the ARPA bill. That was something that a local legislator advocated for, specific earmarks towards their town. And that totaled $3,654,000 over and above the $150 million that was allocated to public housing. There is still $2 million in unallocated ARPA funding that the governor needs to spend. And we're really hoping that we're going to be getting more of that, but we shall see, right? In terms of the $150 million that we received in public housing, $55 million of that went to every housing authority to spend as an extra, kind of equivalent of an extra year of formula funding. We just basically gave every housing authority just like a bonus check of formula funding that they could spend on projects that were critical and or were kind of stalled because there wasn't sufficient funds. We're also putting $93 million towards targeted awards. Specifically, we're doing fire alarm upgrades across the Commonwealth, as well as changing out federal Pacific panels that still exist. Those are actually are very old. If they still are in authorities, the federal Pacific panels are electrical panels that are very, very outdated and have been shown to be a fire hazard. So this is the first time that we've had funds available to be able to make sure that all of those are addressed throughout the Commonwealth. And then we have a very small percentage. I know it's 1.2 million, but it's actually a very small percentage to go towards additional staff that will help us implement these projects and other administrative expenses. So with the ARPA Formula Funding Award, that means that, like I said, every housing authority receives additional ARPA amount equal to their last Formula Funding Award. It does not replace their existing funds, it's to supplement funds. And the same rules apply in terms of how, like what's eligible as a capital expense. We ask that people put the funds towards projects that are already active but not yet in construction, and it frees up regular formula funding uses without the time restrictions. And then, of course, like I said, targeted awards are ways that we can really try to address some systemic issues that we've seen across the portfolio. We've done something similar in the past where there were a lot of septic failures throughout the portfolio, and we found we did a study that allowed us to identify 19 septic systems that were about to fail, and we were able to upgrade them. So so that was great. And then we're using the same process to really do an assessment of our fire alarm systems and our Federal Pacific panels. We had hoped to have enough to do also some elevator repairs and some accessible unit conversions. Unfortunately, the fire alarm systems, when we did the analysis, the fire alarm systems ended up being really like the amount of repair that's necessary for the fire alarm systems, for the most high risk fire alarm systems, also required thorough electrical overhauls. And so we found that we really needed a lot of our funding to try to address that issue. We were able to identify a couple of accessible unit conversions, but most of the funds are going towards the fire alarm systems and Federal Pacific panels. As you might imagine, replacing, all the electrical components in a property is actually really expensive. Some of these projects, like on average, cost like anywhere from $100,000 to $500,000, and so we've found that it's currently really an expensive process. But we are, again, so glad that we have the opportunity to do it. We've also hired new temporary staff to be able to help us with these increased projects. The increased number of projects includes one project manager, an architect, an electrical engineer, a construction advisor, and a new accountant. And these again are temporary 2-year positions. And the deadline was like, we had housing authorities fill out funding proposals. The deadline was June 30th, and those projects you should be seeing actually up and running. A lot of projects that you are seeing currently have ARPA funding involved, which is really exciting. One thing to keep in mind as we're talking about, like, I know that $150 million is a lot of extra money, and something to keep in mind is that like COVID and the really, as you know, put a lot of pressure on the supply of materials and labor. And since COVID started, the cost of construction has gone up significantly. And as you guys know now, there is inflation that also increases the cost of everything. So one of the things to keep in mind is, you can see just in this spreadsheet here, the difference in cost from 2019 to 2021 was like roofing went up 113%. The cost of replacing a fire pump system went up 127%. The cost of replacing a furnace went up 125%. So one of the things to keep in mind is that we were really hoping that these ARPA funds could, at the very least, offset the increased costs that housing authorities have seen just in the last 3 years on how expensive everything is. And I think that while it's been it's been a relief to be able to move some projects forward, it hasn't had as big of an impact as we would like in terms of the need that really exists across the portfolio. And one of the things that I just want to say is, we never would have gotten the ARPA funds if it hadn't been for the advocacy of residents, of boards, of LHA staff. They pushed really, really hard to get these ARPA funds to be able to really address some of the critical things that are happening at the authorities. And so it really is because of you guys, your hard work, and the work at your housing authority that this $150 million even got to us. So thank you guys so much for that. Other kinds of funding, right, that you guys might hear about is HILAPP dollars. This is kind of more a competitive example, right? So an example of competitive funding. So a HILAPP stands for High Leverage Asset Preservation Program. I know that's, what in the world is that? But it basically asks housing authorities find funds in the community or like, grant money somewhere, and then we will match those funds. So it's like $2.50 for every dollar that a housing authority finds elsewhere, whether it's the town, like you can see CPA dollars, CDBG dollars, affordable housing trust funds, any municipal funds. If they get dollars like that, they can apply for HILAPP, and we will match those dollars by 2.5 for every one of theirs. And it's a way for, a lot of other programs to really help support the work that's happened. And we really want to try to encourage that kind of collaboration. So sometimes the HILAPP projects are huge, comprehensive. Sometimes they're just like window projects that now we can, fund more windows as opposed to fewer. So it really is, it's a huge, like a just range of projects and applications that we get for HILAPP. It's a really, really great program. And then the other kind of competitive funding is Mod Phase, which is a modernization project. It really aims to do comprehensive upgrades to sites it's not just a windows project. It's not just a roofing project. It's a really comprehensive roofing plus electrical plus kitchen and bath. Like those are, as you can imagine, multi-million-dollar projects. And we have enough in our budget for maybe 3 or 4 of those every couple of years, but we really do try to identify some of the highest need housing authorities to be able to get some of these Mod Phase grants. One of the other criteria, right, for a Mod Phase is that the housing authority should bring in local service agencies, so that with the upgrade in the components and in the various structures, there's also more services that are at the authority to be able to support residents. And then the last one is our accessible unit initiative. Every once in a while, we have enough funding to really try to do a comprehensive accessible unit initiative. We would like to increase the availability of the accessible units across the state, and only housing authorities that have 0 fully accessible units are eligible for these funds. But we really, really do want to make sure that all housing authorities have at least some accessible units available for their residents. And last but not least, we have things called PIHO, which is it's kind of a program for some of the larger authorities have taken advantage of this. It really is a way to leverage state-aided public housing and the development of new market or affordable units. And so it's like a huge, well, I shouldn't say it's a huge effort to create buildings that are a mix of public housing, of affordable housing, and of new apartments that a community can have. And so it's really intended to make sure that that there's just more, that there are just more units available for residents in those towns that get the PIHO grants. These also tend to be like multi-million-dollar projects, and so we only have enough for maybe 1 or 2 every couple of years. And then the last PIHO, the Public Housing Innovations funds, were Gateway City projects. And so this is capital grants for the redevelopment. Wow, I did not push a button, I promise. It's the Gateway Cities provides capital grants for the redevelopment of state-aided public housing in gateway municipalities. And as you guys might know, Gateway Cities was like a federal designation. And so those specific cities were given the opportunity to apply for funds that would significantly modernize and broaden their economic development for that community. So they're very, very exciting programs. Okay. So sorry about that. So I did not do that. Okay. So we're at the end of my slideshow. And I know you guys have questions, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I will just take time now to answer your questions. And